Welcome to The Favorites, the podcast presented by Bet365. We are part of the Action Network. I am Chad Millman, Chief Content Officer of the Action Network. Very exciting episode today. As I said last week, this show has become the preeminent podcast for authors who want to make their books bestsellers. I think we could narrow it down even further. Authors who are writing about cities and players and teams from the Midwest who want to make their books bestsellers. Today, we are joined by Kansas City native Rustin Dodd, writer for The Athletic, author of a new book on the preeminent quarterback in the NFL. That book is called Kingdom Quarterback Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City Chiefs, and how a once swinging cowtown chased the ultimate comeback. Joining me for this conversation, as always, my co-host, my companion, my compadre, my BFF, professional bettor, Simon Hunter. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Chad. 100 days. 100 days from the Chiefs playing at home, brother. So we're getting closer.
Perfect timing, right? That's why we got Rustin on because look, we're obviously going to want to talk about the book and how Patrick Mahomes has defined this franchise, but also elevated a city. But boy, could the Kansas City Chiefs be more in the middle of it right now? What's going on at wide receiver? What's going on with Travis and Taylor? What the heck's going on with Harris and Butker? How does Patrick Mahomes keep his head and his very specific commercial appeal in the midst of all this chaos? As a reminder, the Favorites podcast is presented by Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day they power up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays. They don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boost. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. Favorites is live on YouTube. For those enjoying on YouTube, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the Action Network YouTube page. Rustin, welcome. The book is interesting because it would be easy for you to say, all right, Patrick Mahomes, I'm in Kansas City, I cover the Chiefs. It's time to write a book about Patrick Mahomes as a biography and get it on the shelves and make some bank. You went a little bit further. You went a little bit deeper. Tell us what you did.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chad. It's a good question. So I want to recognize I had a co-author on this book too, Mark Dent. But I think we really had two ideas. Mark and I are both from Kansas City, and so we sort of have watched the city kind of evolve over the last 25, 30 years as we've kind of become adults. And so we kind of wanted to tell the story of this city. And we thought that the Chiefs were kind of a great entry point into the city because they may be its most, significant export, its like biggest brand, it's, all of those things. And the second thing too is you mentioned it. I mean, I guess we also thought like a straight biography of Patrick Mahomes, like it felt a little premature, right? Like, so we know how great this quarterback is. We know he's like, the best quarterback of his generation and, potentially one of the best of all time. He may be playing at the highest level of all time, but he's also 28. And he's got a lot of career and life to go. So I think trying to sort of write any sort of biography that sort of would define who Patrick Mahomes is or, what what he is right now, it just felt maybe like it would be a little bit premature to try to attempt that project right now. So what we really kind of wanted to do was sort of tell the story of this city and also tell the story of this sort of rise, which is sort of the story of Mahomes that we tell in the book, which is sort of how did he become, the best quarterback in football? How did he become one of the best of all time? So that was sort of what we zeroed in on, sort of like the rise of Mahomes, kind of, right parallel with the city, which was also sort of coming into its own, and also just sort of had, I mean, candidly has, a fascinating history that most people don't know about because, who, unless you're from Kansas City or you have some sort of connection, why would you care? But we really kind of wanted to try to make people care and kind of show that, like, these kind of flyover cities in the middle of the country, Kansas City, Milwaukee, St. Louis, whatever, Cleveland, like these cities have fascinating histories and they can really kind of like tell us something about, the country as well. If that makes sense.
Kansas City, people don't know this, a fabulously famous, romantic, violent mafia town that in the 50s was at the center of what was happening in the sports betting universe. You could trace it from New York to Chicago to Minneapolis to Kansas City. Those were like hubs for sports betting, all because it was such a fantastic mafia town.
Oh yeah, I mean this we don't tell this story in the book too much, but if you watch the movie Casino, there's a scene, where they're in a grocery store in Kansas City and the phone's being bugged, and that's how the skimming operation was discovered.
Simon, I don't know if you know this, but the reason I know all about,
I was gonna say you came out of left field with that mafia question.
do you know how I know? One of the most interesting stories to me, and one of the reasons why sports betting became the scourge of society that it became is because in the 1950s, early 1950s, 50, 51, Estes Kefauver, who was a senator from Tennessee, decided he was going to investigate organized crime in the United States. Held a series of 10 or 12 publicly televised hearings around the country. And this is right when television was first becoming a thing, right? So he was investigating and he was subpoenaing people involved in organized crime all over the country.
You know how
And,
they knew all about that though? Because
well,
they used all these people's contacts in World War II. Like they helped them in World War II, and then the government came back on them 5 years later, which is really, again, that's another interesting story in itself about how they used the mafia in World War II and then went
totally.
against it
Oh my
afterwards. Yeah.
God, dude, it's like no good deed, right?
Yeah.
That
They
might have
give
been
them
when
5 years.
that might have been when they created the term no good deed. So Kefauver then has these hearings,
And this is what,
and
1952?
this is 50, 51. And so Kefauver has these hearings and he's going around the country. And every single time he has another mafia boss testifying, it becomes more and more clear that one of the main sources of revenue and income for the mafia is illegal sports betting. And that at every level of every community, everybody is involved in the chain that is leading to the mafia making money off sports betting. The cops are running rackets. The local restaurants are running rackets. Everybody is sort of involved in this, and it culminates with a moment of testimony with the mafia boss from New York named Frank Costello, who agreed to be interviewed for the hearings, but he would not be shown above his neck. So they would only show him from the neck down, which means they really just showed his hands. And he was twiddling his thumbs the whole time. And they called it the dance of the thumbs. And he admitted to and agreed to and corroborated a lot of what Kefauver had found. No joke. 99% of the televisions in the United States were watching this at the time because it had wrapped up the entire country. Kefauver became like a national hero because of this. Anyways, Rustin.
My favorite story involving gambling in Kansas City is that the feds had bugged the local mafia hideout in Kansas City in 1969. It was a bookmaking operation, and the Chiefs were in the Super Bowl IV against the Vikings. Second time the Chiefs have been in the Super Bowl. the betting patterns in Kansas City were so heavily on the Chiefs. Didn't matter what they did with the line. The thing was so out of whack that the local guys were getting nervous. The local crime boss slipped up. He would never do this, apparently, but he was so worried about the betting patterns on this game that he called down and they got him on wiretap. And that was literally how they were able to bust the local crime boss in Kansas City. And, I mean, the story's been romanticized over the years. There's a lot more to the story, but that's the fun version of it.
Well, listen, crime bosses and gambling, that's always a good time. As long as it's 53 years later and none of us are getting hurt.
Yeah, that stuff's only happened 53 years ago. Everything's changed now.
Simon, can you name the fastest app in the United States?
Game Time.
That's right. It's Game Time. I love Game Time for two reasons. First, they still sponsor this show. Second, I use Game Time all the time. They have amazing last minute deals, including pro and college sports. Speaking of which, I'm going to open Game Time right here from my house here in Connecticut. Look-a-loo. I can get in to see the New York Metropolitans for less than $15 on one of those beautiful nights you're ever going to see in the New York City metropolitan area. No matter where you live, download the Game Time app, get out, have some fun this week. You deserve it. You can redeem code favorites for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, just download the Game Time app. Use code favorites for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. We had Keith O'Brien, Rustin, we talk about being the home for creating bestsellers because we had Keith O'Brien, who wrote a book about Pete Rose and called Charlie Hustle that came out in March, and he was on the show. And the next week, the book hit the bestseller list. So I'm hoping for the same success for you. But he was on the same week that the Ohtani stuff broke. And we were talking about how in that moment, in the 70s, there were bookmakers who walked around the Reds clubhouse all the time, and they were openly discussed. Sparky Anderson referred to one of them as a good luck charm. And that's when it was all underground. And today it's all above ground, but the circumstances and the connections are obviously significantly more sort of forbidden and nefarious, even with it being much less underground than it was, 50 years ago.
No, definitely. It's wild.
So do you think Kansas City's resurgence happens in concert with Patrick Mahomes? Because of Patrick Mahomes, is there some cause effect here, or are they completely independent of each other?
In concert is a good way to put it. I think the story of Kansas City is sort of the story of, like the mid-sized Midwestern city. And we sort of trace, throughout the 20th century, kind of what that means in the book. And then the last 25 years, I think you've seen this sort of pattern, especially pre-COVID. It's maybe changed a little bit after COVID, but this sort of pattern in cities all across America where, the downtowns were sort of being revitalized after sort of being abandoned for, decades. People were moving back into the city, kind of like the reverse of white flight. And so all these sort of trends were definitely present in Kansas City. And, when I was growing up, it depends, I guess, maybe where you're from. But if you're from a place like Kansas City, when I was growing up, Kansas City was a place where people would maybe go work during the day. But after 5 o'clock, it really ceased to be a city. I mean, it was not even really particularly like, the downtown kind of area it was just not a place. It was, people refer to it as a ghost town. I interviewed a local politician who's like, when he was a kid, everybody kind of referred to the city as Belgrade because this was like in the 90s, and it felt like kind of like a bombed out, for lack of a better word, like abandoned place. There's a funny story where a former mayor of Kansas City, before he was the mayor, he was a big time attorney in town. And he claims, and nobody can prove otherwise because he can't prove a negative, I guess, but he claims that he bet a guy that he could walk across downtown Kansas City naked after 5 o'clock and do this without being noticed. And he claims he won the bet. But anyway, that's just like a little bit of a flavor of what the city was like until kind of the early to mid 2000s. And so I think we kind of document sort of the trends of the city, which you can kind of see as national trends. But then within the, when Patrick Mahomes arrives in 2017, the city's sort of already on this upward trajectory. And it's already sort of punching maybe above its weight class. But then Mahomes has kind of changed everything, I think, in terms of particularly, these are kind of, tough things to get your arms around, I guess. But like, he's sort of changed everything about the kind of self-image of Kansas City. I think, this may be true of other places as well, but Kansas City has this sort of really interesting contradiction, I think, where with the people who are from there, in the sense of there's this very intense local pride in the city, in terms of feeling like a very intense devotion and connection to this place, yet also while feeling sort of like this sort of inferiority complex that sort of been there since the beginning, where you're in the middle of the country, you're kind of like in the middle of, for lack of a better word, nowhere, I guess. It's I've lived on the East Coast before too, but it's hard to explain what it, when you're in a place like Kansas City. Chicago's 8 hours away, St. Louis 4 hours away, Dallas is 8 hours away, Denver's 10 hours away. And I mean, these are the other cities that are nearest, around. So you're really kind of like in this place that has major league sports and feels like a vibrant city, but you kind of feel like you're kind of abandoned in this sort of weird center of the United States. And I think that has always kind of been there in the city's self-image and the way it's looked at itself. And I think that's maybe been the biggest change since Patrick Mahomes has arrived. And the idea that, the preeminent athlete in the preeminent American sport, a dynasty, to kind of rival like, any other, decade of kind of dynasty in the NFL. The fact that would happen in Kansas City, I think it's caused people to sort of reconsider Kansas City's place in the world, in this way that, maybe sports shouldn't be that important, but obviously we know, they oftentimes are.
It's like I'm from Chicago, and we used to joke that before Michael Jordan, if you went anywhere outside the United States and you said you were from Chicago, you would immediately get someone referencing Al Capone, because that's kind of what they knew about Chicago. And
Or the
then
loser Cubs.
well, not even that, because like in Europe, they had no idea what the Cubs were. Like they would pretend to shoot a Tommy gun and they would mention Al Capone. Whereas if you went overseas and you said you were from Chicago after the Michael Jordan era, that's all anyone mentioned. It's the same thing for Kansas City. That's how it's evolved.
I think too, Kansas City, you guys are so unique where you're split between two states. Like, I don't know if you know the laws of New Jersey compared to Pennsylvania. If Philadelphia was split down the middle, people would be committing federal crimes 1,000 times every hour. Like, our laws are so different. It's insane. So I feel like, yeah, what you're diving into is so real. And my question here is, if Mahomes has this effect on a city, why do they not want to pay for the stadium? Where I get their view that this is an ownership that I hate, these type of owners that they make their living off the team. I get where the fans are coming from, but I feel like you guys are in this golden era. It's like, just get the people together, right? I would love to hear your view on it. Why are people against buying the stadium where it sounds like it would benefit the whole community? Like what you get, and again, you have a guaranteed here. The man's going to be there for 10 years. I'm interested to hear your view on why they won't approve the stadium.
It's a great question. So I think I mean, it's a complicated answer, but the most simple answer is that the project that was proposed, that was voted down by voters, really it was a Royals project. It was not like a Chiefs forward project. It was a project. It was a project that was initiated by the Kansas City Royals. Obviously, if you're familiar with Kansas City, the Chiefs and Royals, they share a complex. Both stadiums are there at the Truman Sports Complex. They're right side by side. And that's been like that since, the early 1970s when it was built. And so they've always sort of gotten the same things from the city. And anyway, long story short, the Royals have decided in the last 4 to 5 years that they really want to build a downtown stadium. They want to leave Kauffman Stadium and build a downtown stadium. And so the Royals were trying to extend a sales tax that would have gone to the Chiefs and the Royals. And the Chiefs more or less went along with it, saying like, well, if you're going to extend the sales tax and give us money, sure, we'll take it. Maybe we'll renovate Arrowhead. That was basically what they landed on, thinking, okay, it's kind of an iconic stadium. We can do some renovations. And so I think, and then there were a lot of local political things that kind of were reasons that where people became kind of sour with the project. Just a lot of bad PR and locally just like bad messaging in terms of what the stadium would be, where it would be. The site kept changing. All of these things happened. So I think if you put a vote up to Kansas City, voters, and this was also specifically, you mentioned the whole Kansas City two states kind of thing. So, the way it's worked for at least the last few decades is that Jackson County, which is on the Missouri side, has more or less paid for all of the stadium renovations and new stadiums in Kansas City, whereas that's just a fraction of who's in Kansas City. So it's a whole mess. But I do think if they put up a vote saying, would you renovate Arrowhead for these Super Bowl champions? Would you even potentially build a new stadium? I think that vote would pass. It was just this one particular one with the way it was messaged and the way that it felt almost like building a new downtown stadium for the Kansas City Royals. That one did not pass.
Take us back, 2012. Jovan Belcher tragically kills his girlfriend, kills himself in the Chiefs parking lot. That's Romeo Crennel, head coach, Scott Pioli, GM. Next year, Andy Reid takes over. How does he develop, and there's a thread here, but how does he develop an organization that ultimately brings back stability and gets them on the path to get Patrick Mahomes?
I mean, so I think that story, I think, really starts with Clark Hunt. So Clark Hunt, the son of Lamar Hunt, the original founder of the Chiefs. Lamar Hunt dies in the mid 2000s, and Clark Hunt, his son, really kind of takes over as the team, or as the kind of the owner and the kind of the chairman. And I think they hired Scott Pioli in 2009. He hired Todd Haley to be the coach. They kind of thought of like, okay, kind of in that era of, the Patriot way kind of thing. Let's bring that to Kansas City. And it just didn't work for a number of reasons. I think, Scott Pioli was not a great manager of people. And that's been well documented in previous reporting. But also, the thing that, hurt the Chiefs for generations was that they never could find a quarterback, right? And so in 2012, Clark Hunt really said, all right, we need, forget let's hiring the GM who hires the coach. We need to go out and find the coach, and we'll also separately hire a GM, and they'll both report to me. And, the GM and the coach will sort of have equal power in the dynamic. And that's really how they were able to, to get Andy Reid. The timing just happened to be, that was the year that he had kind of, things had run its course in Philadelphia. It was the one year that they didn't have a winning record. I think everybody was just ready to move on. He obviously had gone through some personal tragedy of his own around that time. And so the timing worked out great for the Chiefs that they were able to, Andy Reid didn't want to take time off. There's, this famous story where Clark Hunt called Andy Reid, right as he was walking out of Philadelphia after they had kind of a goodbye ceremony for him. And Clark Hunt was thinking, okay, well, he's not going to, pick up a cold call from a number he doesn't recognize. I'm going to leave a message. And Andy Reid picked up, and he was just sort of like, oh, hello. Yeah, this is Clark Hunt from the Chiefs. Are you still interested in coaching? We want to talk to you. And, there's a whole story about how they were able to kind of beat the Arizona Cardinals to kind of the punch. They were also very interested in Andy Reid. And so I think Andy Reid he offered stability, right? They had some decent players on defense. And then they went out and they traded for Alex Smith, who also brought sort of this level of competency, this level of stability. And, I think if there's one thing about Andy Reid that's maybe his biggest, trait, I guess, it's just his stability, his consistency, he's obviously one of the best, play designers in NFL history, one of the best offensive minds. But when it comes to the skills that make him a really good head coach, I think it's beyond just the offense. I think it's just that sort of stability that he offers an organization. The Chiefs really needed that. And so you saw that from 2013, 14, 15, 16. They get back into the playoffs. Alex Smith is sort of the classic kind of, is he the eighth best quarterback in the league? Is he the 10th best? Is he the 12th best? Whatever, it doesn't matter. But he's good enough to get a team to the playoffs during his prime. And during that era, they really did set sort of a foundation, sort of a base for the organization. And so, they drafted pretty well, all things considered. They built up the roster. And I think by the time, they were ready to pull the trigger on a quarterback, which they thought about drafting a quarterback in 2016. There's a story where they almost were really looking hard at Paxton Lynch. Think about how the NFL history would have changed if they draft him, but they didn't. And so by 2017, they were really looking for a quarterback, and that was the year where there's a whole story about Brett Veach, the GM, who before he was a GM, kind of falling in love with Patrick Mahomes during the draft process. And I think that marriage of just Andy Reid and a team that had been sort of built up to win. And then, bringing in Patrick Mahomes and then even sitting him for a year, it ended up being kind of the perfect formula. I think it's, our book is not, it's necessarily a lesson on like NFL team building or anything like that. But I think there are some lessons to be gleaned from it, which is, obviously the value of a young quarterback, but also just the value of organizational sort of stability and like a foundation before you get to the quarterback, that I think that the Chiefs can prove that, like, you need a quarterback. You need a franchise quarterback if you want to compete for Super Bowls. But sometimes the situation that you put that quarterback in is just as important or close to as important, I guess I would say. And then the Chiefs sort of proved that with what they were able to offer Patrick Mahomes. I think people have always wondered, like, what would Patrick Mahomes have been like if he doesn't go to the Chiefs? Like what if the Chicago Bears pick Mitch Trubisky, same draft? What if he goes there? Is he Patrick Mahomes? And I think my gut instinct is yes, he is, but he doesn't have his career has almost gone pitch perfect to this point, right? He throws 50 touchdown passes the first year as a starter. He wins the Super Bowl in his second year as a starter. He's won 2 MVPs. He's got 3 Super Bowls. He's 28 years old. Like, that probably doesn't happen if he goes to the Bears. The narrative looks different. Like, the path looks different. I think he still gets to that, to that level that he's at, because I think the talent is undeniable. But I think that the situation and that he was put in has allowed him to have, a career that, if you look at it right now, where you could say it may not be likely, but like he really could, have a Tom Brady-esque career when you think of the Super Bowls and the MVPs and the longevity, just on the pace that he's on.
Clarification. Since the Bears trading up to draft Mitch Trubisky and ignoring Patrick Mahomes is a regular theme on this show, I would just say very likely Patrick Mahomes on the Bears, at this point in his career, he's thrown for 60 touchdowns in a season. He's won 5 consecutive Super Bowls. And even though he hasn't played for 10 years, he's probably the MVP of the league at least 10 times. I'm just saying that's the likely scenario. So I disagree with you there, Rustin. It is kind of amazing, though. Like, that's a pivotal moment for 2 marquee franchises. The Bears trade up to draft Mitch Trubisky. They are now on their 3rd top 11 first round quarterback in Caleb Williams, including Mitch Trubisky, in the last, 7 years. And Patrick Mahomes is going to go on to be better than Tom Brady and has already achieved more than maybe all but 4 quarterbacks in NFL history. That is a remarkably right choice. What were the pivot points in the end that got the Chiefs there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned the Bears. Patrick Mahomes Sr., I think he's been on the record saying that the Bears told Mahomes that they were going to draft him. That's Mahomes has clarified that's not actually what they said, but in Mahomes left the meeting before the draft with the Bears thinking that they loved him, like they really flattered him in the meeting, and they left him with the impression that like if the Bears were going to take a quarterback, okay, maybe it's going to be me. And so I think Mahomes is always, there's been when they played the Bears, I think I always get these stories mixed up, but there was the one game where he was counting on his fingers, I think. I'm not sure if that was the Bears game or another team that passed on him, but there's been some moments like that. I think he has feelings towards the Bears about how the draft and the message that they gave him before the draft. But in terms of the Chiefs, I think, Brett Veach, the GM now, but at the time was sort of, a kind of just a pro personnel guy, kind of an assistant GM, looking at Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech. And he just fell in love with him on the tape. And I think, it's easy to maybe, look back and think like, why didn't people think this? What did people miss? And I think, they missed the fact that he was playing at Texas Tech. So people maybe felt like there was a bias towards like, all right, he's putting up big numbers, but that's not that unusual. And there was a little bit bias towards, all right, they're not really like winning. And then I think the biggest bias towards Patrick Mahomes, or biased against him, I guess I should say, was that he had really bad mechanics. Like he really was raw, like he didn't really start playing quarterback as a full-time until his junior year of high school. Then he, has incredible numbers in Texas. Texas Tech falls in love with him. They bring him to Lubbock. He puts up huge numbers, but like if you watch the tape, he's kind of all over the place, right? So like his arm angles kind of all over the place. It's very inconsistent. His footwork oftentimes was like terrible. And Brett Veach is watching the tape, and I think instead of thinking like, wow, this guy's footwork is pretty bad, he was thinking like, well, this guy's incredible and his footwork is terrible. Like, what happens if you actually give this guy just like a little bit of coaching and like tighten some things up? And so I think instead of thinking in terms of like, the what does this guy like do well, I think, there's maybe a lesson about the traits that you need and all those sort of things. And anyway, I think that the Chiefs, they fell in love, and they at the perfect time and went up and traded for Mahomes. I mean, there's lots of stories. The Saints, Sean Payton's on the record. He loved Patrick Mahomes in the draft. Bruce Arians has said the same thing. But the Chiefs were the only team that went up and got him in the draft. And I think they were convicted that they had the right guy. And I don't know. I think there's maybe, some lessons too about just the Patrick Mahomes, the person, and the makeup. And, he grew up, we write about this in the book, but he's kind of has a fascinating childhood in terms of, you look at him and you sort of look at this generation of like stars who were sons of professional athletes. And you can say, well, he's got the genes. He grew up, his father was a professional baseball player. So like all throughout his life, Patrick Mahomes just sort of expected that he was going to be a professional athlete. Like that was just like sort of, people thought it was going to be baseball, but like that was sort of his mindset as a kid. Like, oh, this is not an unusual thing at all. He hung around with, major league clubhouses and Alex Rodriguez and like was exposed to that life. He just sort of, that's kind of what he thought his life would be like. But the other thing is that he also grew up in East Texas, sort of in this sort of small East Texas town. Like East Texas is a lot different than Dallas, or it's a lot different than Houston. It's a different vibe. It's a little bit more Southern. It's just like you're kind of out there in the middle of nowhere. And I think because he was so late to football and he had spent so much time playing baseball, that when it came to football, I think he felt like he had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. Like Texas Tech was the only school that wanted to recruit him, the only Power Five school, I should say. There was like Rice and Houston, and those kind of schools were kind of interested. But Texas Tech was the only Power Five school. Texas didn't want him. He wasn't like an elite 11 kind of quarterback who was preordained as the next big thing when he's a sophomore in high school. So he simultaneously had this innate confidence where he was like, all right, I'm going to be, a professional athlete, while also having this thing that was really, really driving him, which is that he was late to football, and that he had to sort of prove himself. And I think that combination, and along with some other things that you can't know from just scouting a kid, but like, he's a smart guy. He's got a photographic memory. He retains things. Like he could probably tell you every play he's ever had in football, like, down to, like the minute detail. He's kind of like one of those guys. I think, Steph Curry, I think has a similar, I've read stories about him having a similar sort of photographic memory. And so you add all that in together, and I think that's where he's the separator is, right? So there's the physical tools, but those kind of combinations of things, I think, are what separate Patrick Mahomes from his peers.
Yeah, and definitely, I know Chad beats himself up always about the Bears thing, but just that draft in general, you look at it, no one saw this coming, just because you had about a 10-year run there of all these guys being drafted out of the Big 12, playing those spread offenses that just weren't good, right? It was just because no one played defense in that conference. And that's why, I understood their excuse why they didn't really want to take him. But again, the Cleveland, who had been tanking for years, passed on him to take a DN. Jacksonville, who never had a really good quarterback, passed on him to take Leonard Fournette at the 4th pick overall. And the Mahomes thing to me will always be, your GM talked about it. They watched a game where Texas Tech was losing by 40 points, and Mahomes was out there getting killed, getting crushed. Like his offensive line couldn't block anybody. And he was still standing in the pocket, making amazing throws downfield. And he said he sent that to Andy Reid, and he was like, can you believe that this kid isn't being talked about? Like, can you believe that we might be able to get this kid? And that was one of my favorite stories about that, where it's like they saw what we couldn't see.
Yeah, I think they played LSU in a bowl game when Mahomes was a sophomore. So he wasn't draft eligible yet, but Brett Veach was watching the game. He was looking at some other guys, and, LSU had Leonard Fournette and like NFL players all over the field.
Yeah, the Honey Badger.
Yeah. And Mahomes was, like, he was like keeping his team in the game, like relatively speaking, but like was making plays against, future NFL guys. And that was the moment where Brett Veach, started pestering Andy Reid. And, there's a funny story where Brett Veach, he was on him from that moment. And then the next season, so the 16 season heading into the 2017 draft, he keeps sending Andy Reid all these clips, and that's the famous story. And he's sending him. Finally, Andy Reid has to tell him, like, just like chill a little bit. And then after the season, Andy Reid like gets the first, I don't know, some mock draft that he pulls off the internet. And I'm not sure where it was from, but CBS, ESPN, whatever, some mock draft he's got on his desk. And he calls Brett Veach in, and he's like, hey, I see this mock draft, like, your boy's not even in the first round. Like, what about that guy? And that's the other thing. Patrick Mahomes was.
I had Watson higher than him. I'll be the first to admit it. Like I did. Watson was more proven at the time, right?
He obviously climbed a lot during the pre-draft process, but heading into that, around the combine right before that, he was sort of graded as a 2nd or 3rd round pick. He was young too, right? So he was only had 3 years at Texas Tech, so he was a young junior. But yeah, it was, even at that moment, I think people kind of saw him as sort of this freakish sort of quarterback talent that would need some time to develop.
Summertime is a great time for gamblers to focus on their health, and we can all eat better this summer with our sponsor, Factor. Every fresh, never frozen meal is chef crafted and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. Choose from a weekly menu of 35 options, including popular options like Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus, or Vegan and Veggie. So what are you waiting for? Get started today and fuel up for your summer goals. Get chef prepared meals on the table in 2 minutes with Factor's ready-to-eat meals so you can get back to doing what you love this spring. Customize your weekly meals with the flexibility to get as much or as little as you need. Pause or reschedule deliveries to suit your lifestyle. Factor is your solution for fast premium meals without the hassle of cooking. Just head to factormeals.com/favorites50 and use code favorites50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box. That's code favorites50 at factormeals.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next box while your subscription is active. So it's interesting you mentioned Steph Curry. In our pre-show, we were talking about Mahomes feels like a superstar who is so supremely confident in his skill. He's very comfortable sharing the spotlight.
He's texting his wife after that Raiders game when they get embarrassed that they're about to go win a Super Bowl. I mean, the guy has the highest confidence I've ever
he's
heard
got the highest confidence, right? But,
ever.
There's a lot of guys like Steph Curry. He was totally fine bringing in Kevin Durant and sharing the spotlight and sharing the court and sometimes deferring to him. Patrick Mahomes seems like the guy who is very comfortable sharing the spotlight with Travis Kelce, who brings people in. Like there's a combination of his talent and his demeanor that you point out that I think elevates him probably further than someone who might have equal talent.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched a lot of Patrick Mahomes press conferences in the last 5 years. Post-game interviews, like hours and hours of him answering questions. I can't remember him ever not saying the right thing. Granted, a lot of it is like,
unless you're a referee.
Well, I will say that is the one slip up he's had, and people still talk about it in Kansas City, is him yelling at the referees and then even telling Josh Allen after the game, like, oh, yeah, I can't believe a horrible call or whatever. And I guess it's the exception that proves the rule, because literally the next day, Patrick Mahomes like apologized in the press conference and was like, yeah, I'm really sorry to Josh Allen. I felt bad about that. What I was going to say was, a lot of it you could say it's media training. It's, we shouldn't put too much, like stock into just press conference interviews. But I think it speaks to Patrick Mahomes something about his kind of his own personality, in the sense that I think he puts time thinking into what he wants to say. I think he thinks like almost like a politician might or something. Like he's prepares himself for everything. So, like when Harrison Butker's situation comes up recently and he knows he has to answer questions, he wants to say like, all right, how do I answer this in the most thoughtful way possible that, can say what I want to say while also saying what the team will want me to say, and like all these sort of things. And I think he just thinks on a higher level when it comes to that kind of stuff. And where does it come from? I mean, I guess where does that ever come from? I guess it's his upbringing, it's his parents, it's his the community in which he was raised, like all those sort of things. But it is pretty remarkable how he never really slips up, and is able to say the right things.
Well, look, it's also remarkable how you mentioned Harrison Butker. During the season, there was Taylor Swift stuff. The team did not always perform well. They didn't have top flight receivers. Now their top flight receiver is getting in trouble, not sitting with him and Travis Kelce at the Mavs game. Like, how does he, in the middle of all this, not let any of it impact him?
I mean, it's a great question. I think he's able to compartmentalize. I mean, that's one of his skills, to I don't know, to have perspective, to compartmentalize, to not show frustration that he probably, when he does feel it, he's able to more or less kind of suppress it in the public eye. I mean, you see like little bits and pieces of it. I mean, there's a nickname in Kansas City that I'm not sure if it totally fits, but you'll get the idea that there's like a petty side of Patrick Mahomes. People call him Petty Patrick. And you sort of see this bubble up from time to time, especially on the field, the way he, like talks trash with players, or like the way he holds grudges, very Michael Jordan like. The way, I mean, I know, a lot of big athletes hold grudges and they use anything as motivation, but Patrick Mahomes is able to, like, I think he takes it to like the Michael Jordan type level of holding grudges.
Yeah, I can see that. He seems like the kind of guy that he remembers all those guys taken ahead of him in the draft, and he kind of used that when he first came into the league. So, yeah, just before obviously we let you go, we're talking Kansas City. We got to know about the barbecue. What's your number one spot? I mean, you've grown up there, you live there. Are you going to go with what everyone knows, or do you have a local spot that not many people might know about?
Well, I'll give you three names
Perfect.
then. So the classic, if you want like classic Kansas City barbecue, like the full on experience, I would go to Arthur Bryant's. So Arthur Bryant's, the original location is around like 22nd Street. It's where the old Chiefs played. Their original stadium, Municipal Stadium, was like around the corner from that. That is like the true kind of Kansas City barbecue experience. If you want this sort of new generation experience, that's Joe's. Joe's is, the famous for its Z-Man sandwich. It's in a gas station. That's where I think that's probably the best pound for pound barbecue in Kansas City is
Love
Joe's.
it.
Joe's KC. But if you want like an under the radar pick, LC's is what I would say. That's also kind of just a classic Kansas City barbecue spot. It's kind of near the Chiefs Stadium, Arrowhead Stadium now. You'll find yourself sort of in a place where you're like, there's a restaurant here, but it has some of the best barbecue in America. So yeah, LC's, Joe's, and Arthur Bryant's would be my three picks.
All right, Rustin Dodd. For those watching on YouTube right now, for some reason I'm frozen, but you can still hear me. Rustin Dodd, co-author of the book Kingdom Quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, the Kansas City Chiefs, how a once swinging Cowtown chased the ultimate comeback. Fascinating story at a fascinating time about one of the most interesting athletes playing any sport today. As a reminder, the Favorites podcast is presented by Bet365. Bet365 doesn't do ordinary. That's why you get more boosts with them than with anyone else. Every day they power up the odds on hundreds of bets to give you a chance to win more. Bet365 boosts specific markets, your winnings, and even parlays. They don't stop there. Keep an eye out for their biggest and best odds with the incredible Super Boosts. Check out the boost and see why it's never ordinary at Bet365. Must be 21 or older and present in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, North Carolina, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, or 18 and older in Kentucky. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. Terms, conditions, restrictions apply. Simon and I are back for our next episode of The Faves on the Action Network YouTube page, Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern. Download us Spotify, Apple Pods, wherever you get your pods. Rate, review, subscribe, leave us 5 stars, say whatever you want. Feedback is a gift. Till Thursday. Love you.
Action Network reminds you, please gamble responsibly. If you or someone you care about has a gambling problem, help is available 24/7 at 1-800-GAMBLER.